Well, the mission was to provide legal support to the women's human rights activism that was burgeoning internationally and regionally. We actually started thinking that we would focus entirely on the Americas, North and South. The CUNY Research Fund enabled us to make a trip to Latin America to consult with people there about what to do and where to put whether we were needed and where to put our attention. Out of that, we were advised to take up the issue of violence against women because that's what was burgeoning all over Latin America, and involved our clinic students in the first year in the drafting and critique of the Inter-American Convention on the elimination of, it's actually the Inter-American Convention on the eradication, prevention, and punishment of violence against women. So that was a very early initiative. At the same time, what was happening was that the global movement, of which the regional was a part, was focusing on the UN system and on a series of conferences in the UN system where as we created a series of women's caucuses and actually transformed the agenda of the conference. So one example is in 1993, there was a Vienna conference on human rights. It was the second World Conference. Women were not on the international agenda at that time. Human rights was male-defined, androcentric in its approach, and we went as a caucus to influence the documents that came out of the conference to recognize that there had to be a major change around gender. At the same time, the rape of women, the sexual violence against women in the former Yugoslavia had been finally revealed and emerged, and that was a burning issue on the agenda of the conference. So there was this convergence of a horrific attack on women and a movement, and the survivors and the advocates coming from that movement, and this global movement that really did span all the regions of the world. Among the major things that came out of that was a mandate to integrate, the way it's called is to integrate gender into the human rights system. And so what that meant was that it was our task, which we had defined as our task, to look at what were male-defined, male-oriented rights and reconceptualize them to apply to the things that happen to women. Sexual violence against women was one thing that really wasn't recognized as a serious violation, although sexual violence against men was. Women, for example, were tortured if they were beaten the way men were, but they weren't tortured if they were raped. So there were a lot of, many ways in which we began redefining rights, the most basic of which is most of the violence against women occurs in the private sphere. And the argument was you can't possibly bring in the private sphere to international human rights. International human rights is only what states are doing to their people, not what private people are doing to each other. And at the same time, as if you read the international human rights documents, you see that states have both a negative responsibility to respect and not to do harm, and a positive responsibility to protect, right? And it was out of that positive responsibility that we argued that the failure, for example, to address domestic violence, which was the most epidemic form of violence in the world, that the failure to address domestic violence was a human rights problem because the state failed in its obligation to protect people against that violence. You don't see that in the U.S. Constitution, for example. We don't have any positive obligations, but you have a very, very central and important positive obligation in human rights law.